It begins on a night that history tried to erase. February 12th, 1886. Winter lay heavy on the Bavarian Alps, snow pressing against the slopes, winds whispering through the pine forests. The borders of empire and kingdom were fragile here. Vienna's authority stretching west, Bavaria's reach pressing east, and between them ran a rail line known simply as the Alpine Corridor. That night, the express train from Vienna departed with 11 carriages and more than 200 passengers. Merchants in fur-lined coats, diplomats bound for Munich, widows wrapped in black wool, children clutching wooden toys. Steam hissed into the frozen night, lanterns swayed, and the steel wheels carried them steadily through valleys where the villages kept their shutters closed. At 11:42 p.m., the train reached Rosenheim station, the last Bavarian checkpoint before the mountains swallowed the line. The routine inspection began. Lanterns sweeping along each carriage, inspectors checking doors, names noted in ledgers. But when the count was complete, something was wrong. 11 carriages had departed Vienna. Only 10 stood in Rosenheim. Carriage 9 was gone. The couplings dangled loose. Snow dusted the trackbed. And yet there was no wreckage, no derailment, no splintered wood on the stones. 47 passengers, men, women, children, had been sealed in their seats only minutes earlier. Now, they were nowhere. The first account of this event came from an unlikely source. A railway clerk named Lucas Brenner, a junior employee tasked with duplicating reports. He was precise, diligent, invisible to the officers above him. But Lucas had a habit of making copies of everything he wrote, storing them in his personal ledger. And because of this habit, his words survived where official records did not. In his copy, he noted the most forbidden detail. Carriage 9 is missing. The doors sealed themselves. The passengers are silent. Officially, the explanation was mundane. The Ministry of Transport claimed the carriage had detached earlier, somewhere on the Austrian side, and would soon be recovered. But no recovery was ever reported. No bodies, no luggage, not even a broken wheel. The line was scoured by patrols for weeks, but nothing surfaced. One witness, a signalman posted near the forest crossing, offered another version. He swore he saw the 9th carriage still attached as the train roared past his booth. He even glimpsed pale faces in the windows. Then came a sound, a low, steady hum that made his lantern tremble. He blinked, and the carriage was gone. His report was struck out, his testimony dismissed as fatigue, but Lucas copied it down, noting in the margin, "If this is true, the line itself is cursed." Think about that for a moment. A train departs with 11 carriages. It arrives with 10. 47 lives vanish into thin air. The families wrote desperate letters to newspapers. Embassies petitioned the ministry. And within months, silence fell. Names disappeared from rosters. Files burned in clerical accidents. And the vanished were reduced to rumor. Yet the ledger remained. That is why you are hearing this story tonight. Without Lucas, there would be nothing but whispers. And so we begin in a very specific place and time. Rosenheim Station, 1886. A frozen platform on the edge of empire, lanterns swinging in confusion. A clerk's trembling hand scratching forbidden words into a ledger. What happened that night was not chance. It was not a broken coupling. It was the first glimpse of something larger, a design hidden beneath the surface of history. Because silence, when it spreads too perfectly, is never natural. And tonight, that silence begins to speak. The silence at Rosenheim Station did not last long. Within hours, telegraphs had been dispatched along the line, and search parties spread into the snowbound valleys. Lanterns combed the frozen forests, dogs were brought in to sniff the drifts, and officers scoured every stretch of track. But they found nothing. No splintered wood, no iron wheels, no torn luggage. Only smooth rails gleaming in the frost, as though the carriage had never existed. The Ministry of Transport in Vienna issued its first statement 2 days later. It was carefully worded. Due to an unfortunate coupling failure, one carriage was separated near Salzburg. All passengers are presumed lost in the terrain. Search and recovery operations continue. The problem was Salzburg. The missing carriage had already passed that checkpoint. It had been counted by the customs officers. Lucas Brenner, still copying every document, noted this inconsistency. In his ledger, beside the ministry statement, he underlined the word Salzburg and wrote in the margin, "Impossible." For a few weeks, the story lived in the newspapers. Families placed frantic notices, seeking information on my wife, Clara Vogel, last seen aboard the Alpine Corridor Express, Carriage 9. Some published photographs, faded and stiffly posed, of the vanished. But then, just as quickly as the story had appeared, it was gone. Columns stopped running. Editors refused to print follow-ups. Even the family's pleas disappeared from the pages. What silenced them? Lucas's private notes suggest the arrival of a man he refers to only as the inspector. He does not provide a name, only a description. Tall, angular, wearing a grey overcoat despite the snow. He claimed to be an investigator from Vienna, sent to oversee the inquiry, yet no official record of his posting exists. Witnesses at the station remembered him for one reason. He asked questions that had nothing to do with broken couplings or derailments. Instead, he asked whether anyone had heard unusual sounds that night. He asked about the signalman's report of a humming vibration. He asked if anyone had seen strange lights around the forest line. The signalman himself, who had insisted he saw the carriage moments before it vanished, was dismissed within a week. Lucas writes, he left his post, his room cleared, his pension withdrawn. He is not spoken of again. Meanwhile, the families were summoned, one by one, to meetings in closed offices. They emerged, pale, silent, unwilling to speak further. Some were granted generous compensation. Others vanished into silence themselves, their homes shuttered within months. There is one surviving fragment from this stage of the investigation. A nun from Salzburg, Sister Agnes, kept a diary. She had travelled on the train only 2 carriages ahead of the missing one. Her diary entry, dated February 14th, reads, "There was a heaviness in the air, as if a storm pressed down. I prayed for calm, then came a vibration, like a bell struck inside the bones. For a moment, I thought the world held its breath. Then the sensation passed. When we reached Rosenheim, the 9th carriage was gone. The officers told us it had never existed, but I saw the faces at the windows." Her diary was discovered decades later in the convent archives. By then, Sister Agnes had long since taken her vows of silence and never spoke of the incident again. The inspector never filed a public report. The official explanation, coupling failure, was quietly archived. But Lucas noted something chilling. In the ledger, after the final entry on the Rosenheim disappearance, he wrote, "The passengers are not dead. They are held. But by whom? Held. Not lost, not killed, held." This single word shifts everything. If the carriage did not crash, if it did not splinter, then perhaps it was taken, moved, hidden. And if it was hidden, then someone, perhaps the inspector, perhaps others, knew where it had gone. This was no accident. It was a removal. The inspector arrived quietly, but his presence lingered like frost. Lucas's notes describe him only in fragments. A tall frame, impossibly thin, with eyes that did not blink enough. He wore a grey wool overcoat, buttoned to the throat, and even in the bitter cold of February he kept his gloves on, as though touch itself was forbidden. He never showed identification. Instead, he carried a folded letter, sealed in red wax. The station master accepted it without question, and from that moment, the inspector's authority seemed absolute. Witnesses later remembered how he moved along the platform the morning after the disappearance, his boots crunching against the snow, pausing at each coupling as though listening. More than once he stopped, placed a gloved hand against the iron rail, and closed his eyes. He was not searching, Lucas wrote. He was measuring something invisible. The inspector interviewed everyone who had been near the vanished carriage, the surviving passengers, the station guards, even the kitchen porter who had served bread to the families inside carriage 9 before departure. His questions were strange. He asked not what they saw, but what they felt. Did they notice changes in air pressure? Did their lamps dim? Did the taste of the wine alter? And always, he asked about the sound. One porter told him of a faint vibration that made the glasses rattle. Another swore the benches hummed like a tuning fork. A third shook his head and said nothing. 2 days later, that same man was transferred far away to Innsbruck, never to speak of it again. Lucas, watching from the margins, became convinced this was no ordinary inspector. His notes contain a sketch of the wax seal on the inspector's letter, a circle enclosing an inverted hourglass. Lucas drew it twice, underlining it with the words, "Not a government mark." The families who demanded answers began to encounter the inspector as well. One widow, Frau Lechner, came to Rosenheim daily, carrying her son's photograph. On the fourth day, she was summoned into the station master's office. The inspector was waiting. She left an hour later with a purse of coin and an expression Lucas described as hollow. She never returned. Within a week, every vocal family had either fallen silent or vanished from the town entirely. Compensation was paid. Houses stood empty. The newspapers stopped printing their notices. It was as though Carriage 9's passengers had been erased, not only from the train, but from memory itself. And yet, scraps resisted erasure. A conductor, drinking heavily weeks later, confessed to Lucas that the inspector had ordered all remaining staff to describe the train as having only 10 carriages. Write it. Repeat it. 10. 10. Never. 11. When Lucas asked why, the conductor whispered, "Because he said the truth is fragile. If too many speak it, it will break." But Lucas kept writing. The final entry about the inspector in his ledger is brief, almost a warning to himself. "He watches me. He knows I copy. If these notes are found, then I am gone as well." It was the last mention of Lucas in any surviving records. His name vanishes soon after from railway rosters. No death notice, no transfer, no pension file. He was erased like the passengers he tried to preserve, but the symbol, the inverted hourglass, remained in his ledger. That, perhaps, is more telling than any testimony, because the hourglass does not just measure time, it controls it. The official inquiry into Carriage 9 closed with indecent speed. By March of 1886, barely a month after the disappearance, the Ministry of Transport released a final communiqué. It repeated the same refrain. A coupling failure. No survivors. The matter was declared resolved, the line reopened, and the incident relegated to the margins of history. Yet silence, when too perfect, is suspicious, and in the quiet that followed, small echoes survived. Lucas's ledger was one, Sister Agnes's diary another, and then there were whispers passed between railway men, always after dark, always with lowered voices. They spoke of a draft that moved through sealed carriages, of lantern flames that bent sideways without wind, of a vibration that made teeth ache and bones hum. The most haunting account came not from the railway, but from the villages along the line. A farmer's daughter in Berghof claimed that on the night of February 12th, she awoke to find her window pane trembling as though struck by sound. Outside, she saw nothing but darkness, yet in the silence, she swore she heard voices 40 or 50 at once, murmuring as if from underground. Her story was dismissed as a dream. Still, she repeated it to her children until her dying day. Meanwhile, the families of the vanished found their petitions returned, unopened. Those who pressed harder discovered their letters lost in clerical errors. Some who persisted were offered stipends for their silence. Others found themselves facing sudden audits, debts, or police inquiries. It was as if the world itself was conspiring to bury their grief. And then came the strangest development of all. Carriage 9's number was reassigned. By summer of 1886, a new coach was built, painted, and designated as Carriage 9. It was as though the missing carriage had never existed. The ledgers showed continuity. The records were clean, but memory is not so easily replaced. Conductors still muttered about the lost 9. Passengers whispered warnings to avoid that carriage, and among the railway clerks, the inverted hourglass symbol began to appear, scratched faintly into desk drawers, carved beneath benches, drawn in chalk on station walls. Who drew it? No one ever confessed, but the symbol spread like a secret contagion. It was not simply a sign of remembrance. It was a warning. Somewhere in Vienna, far from the snowbound valleys, another record was kept. In 1887, a private physician named Dr. Emil Hartmann published a curious paper in a journal of experimental physiology. His subject, resonant harmonics and cellular stasis. Buried among technical jargon was a single, chilling line. Initial trials suggest that under certain frequencies, biological processes may be arrested while consciousness persists. The journal was quickly withdrawn. Hartmann's reputation collapsed. He vanished from Vienna within a year, but fragments of his work survive, and in one margin, in Hartmann's own hand, appears a familiar sketch, an inverted hourglass. Lucas had guessed correctly. Carriage 9 was not an accident. It was an experiment. The passengers were not lost to snow, nor crushed in wreckage. They were subjects 47 men, women, and children, selected by chance or design, sealed in steel and wood, and exposed to something the world was not meant to see. The silence at Rosenheim was not death. It was stasis, and if the experiment succeeded once, it would not end there. The inverted hourglass was not the invention of a single inspector or a wandering physician. By the late 1882, it had appeared in scattered places across Vienna and Munich, scratched into library tables, stamped in wax seals, carved discreetly onto the cornerstones of new institutions. It marked the presence of something more organized, something Lucas had only glimpsed. From fragments of correspondence preserved in private collections, we know that in 1887, a circle of industrialists, academics, and physicians began meeting in Vienna under the name Die Umkehrungsgesellschaft, the Reversal Society. To outsiders, it was a club for intellectual debate, a gathering of modern men fascinated by the intersection of science and philosophy. But within its sealed salons, their obsession was singular: to control time itself. The surviving membership lists are incomplete, deliberately obscured, but certain names reappear. Count Wilhelm von Roth, a steel magnate; Dr. Emil Hartmann, the disgraced physiologist; Judge Karl Weiss, who presided over several suspiciously silenced cases. Each had suffered personal loss: a child, a wife, a beloved sibling. Each spoke publicly of progress and enlightenment, and each privately pursued what they called stasis experiments. The Rosenheim disappearance was not mentioned directly, but among their minutes from 1888 appears the phrase, "The carriage proved viable. Expansion is possible." What carriage? What expansion? The answer becomes clearer when we examine their funding. Within 2 years of the Rosenheim incident, enormous sums of money flowed into a newly established front: the Alpine Society for Technological Inquiry. Officially, it sponsored lectures on steam engineering and mechanics. Unofficially, it purchased vast amounts of copper wire, resonant steel, and quartz crystals, materials unsuitable for locomotives, but perfect for devices that produced vibration and frequency. The inspector in the grey overcoat was almost certainly their agent. He did not arrive to solve the disappearance. He arrived to manage it, to erase the witnesses, to pay off the grieving, and to seed the official narrative. The fellowship, though the name came later, understood that secrecy was more powerful than violence. Death left corpses, but silence left nothing. By ensuring no one could prove Carriage 9 had ever existed, they not only concealed their success, but laid the groundwork for future trials. And trials there were. Small rumors trickled through the 1892, a sanatorium in Innsbruck where patients slept for years without aging, a monastery in northern Italy whose bell tower was said to produce tones that halted birds mid-flight, a shipment of miners in Tyrol who vanished without record after entering experimental housing provided by a company tied to Count Roth. Each story was dismissed as folklore, as ghost tales, but the pattern is unmistakable. The experiment continued, moving outward, always in the shadows, always shielded by wealth and law. The inverted hourglass, their emblem, symbolized more than time turned upside down. It symbolized permanence, a refusal of decay. To them, the tragedy of Rosenheim was not tragedy at all, but triumph. They had stopped time for 47 people. The next challenge was to control it, to harness it, to replicate it at will. In the ashes of Lucas's vanished life, the fellowship grew bolder. They realized something chilling. It was easier to erase truth than to explain it, and so they rewrote history. Among the scattered names tied to the Reversal Society, one appears again and again: Count Wilhelm von Rauth. Born in 1839 to a dynasty of steel magnates in Graz, von Rauth embodied the contradictions of the late empire. He was educated in Vienna, spoke 4 languages, entertained composers in his marble halls, and financed railways that cut through mountains. To the public, he was a patron of progress, but privately, he carried a wound that never healed. In 1874, von Routh's only daughter, Clara, died of a sudden fever at the age of 7. Witnesses recalled how the Count stood by her grave for hours, unmoving. As snow buried the flowers at his feet, he seemed carved of ice, one servant whispered. From that moment, he withdrew from society. When he re-emerged, it was with an obsession. He began financing unusual studies. University records show endowments for research in vibratory medicine, experiments in crystalline resonance, and biological preservation. He imported rare stones from the East, paid inventors to design instruments that could hum at exact frequencies, and surrounded himself with men who promised permanence. Von Routh became the quiet center of the Reversal Society. It was in his salon, beneath frescoed ceilings, that discussions of Carriage 9 first took place openly. Surviving notes from one of these gatherings record him saying, "Decay is not nature's law, it is nature's flaw, and flaws can be corrected." For von Routh, Rosenheim was not a tragedy but a demonstration. When informed of the 47 vanished passengers, he is said to have nodded and replied, "Then, it is possible." And so he sought to refine the process. In 1889, 3 years after Rosenheim, von Routh quietly purchased a sanatorium in Innsbruck. Officially, it was to be a charitable institution for patients with chronic illnesses. Unofficially, it became a laboratory. Records, unearthed decades later, show irregular shipments of copper wire, tuning forks, and bell metal alloys, materials that had no medical purpose. Former staff, interviewed long after, described hearing machines that sang deep beneath the building. Patients were brought in, given no diagnosis, and placed in isolated chambers where a low hum never ceased. Some emerged unchanged. Others, staff claimed, simply stopped. One orderly recalled a girl of 16 who had arrived with her parents. She was pale but healthy. After weeks in the humming chamber, she was seen sitting upright in her bed, eyes open, chest rising faintly, but she did not speak. She did not blink. She did not age. Days passed, then weeks. Flowers wilted beside her bed, replaced again and again. She remained untouched. The staff called her still the silent one. The girl's fate was never recorded, but in the Reversal Society's minutes from 1890, one line stands out. Subject maintained for 47 days, without degradation. Von Routh had achieved what he longed for. The halting of time, not for minutes or hours, but for weeks. But this was not science pursued in open halls. It was an empire of silence built on secrecy, bribes, and threats. When one physician objected, calling the experiments immoral, he vanished on his way to Vienna. His carriage was found abandoned by the roadside, his papers gone. For von Routh, morality was irrelevant. In a letter to Judge Weiss, he wrote, "Would you not kill time itself, if you could? Would you not cut its throat for the ones you love?" The answer, among these men, was always yes. Von Routh died in 1901, but not before his obsession had spread. By then, the Reversal Society had become a network reaching across Europe. Bankers in Zurich, scientists in Milan, even parliamentarians in Berlin. The inverted hourglass was no longer scratched in shadows. It appeared in architecture, in stained glass windows, in the funding seals of new universities. But its roots remained personal. For von Routh, the pursuit began with a daughter lost to fever. For his peers, it began with their own losses, their own grief, and together they believed they had found a way to master time, not just for themselves, but for those they chose to preserve. The cost, of course, was silence. The silence of the vanished, the silenced, the erased, and in that silence, the fellowship was born. By the mid-1890s, nearly a decade after Rosenheim, the official silence was complete. No newspapers carried the story. No authorities admitted the incident had ever occurred. The fellowship's reach was so wide, so meticulous, that even local parish records omitted names of the vanished families. And yet, faint cracks appeared. From these cracks, voices escaped. In 1894, a railway guard named Joseph Adler left his position at Rosenheim station and emigrated to America. Decades later, in a Boston tavern, he told a story to a journalist who recorded it on the back of an envelope. Adler claimed that on the night of February 12, 1886, he had been stationed near the sidings when the train slowed. He saw the inspector step down from carriage 9 while it was still in motion, lantern in hand. Moments later, the carriage jolted violently, and Adler heard a sound like 1,000 bees inside a glass jar. When the train entered Rosenheim, the carriage was gone. Adler said he was threatened afterward, told to repeat only that the coupling broke. But the sound, he swore, was not mechanical, it was alive. Another fragment comes from the personal papers of Father Benedict, a priest in Salzburg. In a letter never sent, he wrote, "They brought me a child. She had been on the train. She was pale as chalk, her eyes open, her lips moving soundlessly. Her mother begged me to bless her, but when I placed the cross upon her forehead, I felt no heat, no pulse. Still, she breathed. Still, she looked at me, and when I whispered the Lord's Prayer, she mouthed the words without sound." The next day, both mother and child were gone from the parish, their names erased from our rolls. This letter was found hidden inside a hymnal nearly 50 years later. And then there is the most chilling testimony of all, preserved in the archives of a small Alpine newspaper. It is unsigned, likely written by a surviving passenger, though no name was given. The paper never published it, but a clerk kept the draft in his private drawer. It reads, "I remember the lanterns swaying. I remember laughter, the clink of glasses. Then came a vibration, soft at first, then stronger. My teeth ached. My heart seemed to slow. Around me people froze in place. A woman with a spoon halfway to her lips. A man turning his head to answer a question. Their eyes moved, but their bodies did not. I alone could still move, though sluggishly, as though wading through water. Then the windows dimmed, as though frost covered them. I rose to my feet. The sound was inside my skull, a low, droning hum. I tried to speak, but my voice came out broken, as if torn away. Then I saw him, a man in a grey coat, standing in the aisle, untouched by the vibration. He carried a small device in his hand, a box of iron with a coil that glowed faintly blue. He turned a dial, and the hum ceased. Everyone remained frozen, and then, so did I. The account ends there, the ink blotched by what looks like water damage, or perhaps tears. If even fragments of these testimonies are true, then the implications are terrifying. The passengers of Carriage 9 were not lost to fire or snow. They were trapped in a state of living stasis, their bodies frozen, their consciousness dimmed, their lives stolen but not extinguished. The testimonies reveal something else as well. There were survivors, even if only briefly. People who saw, who remembered, who tried to speak, but each was silenced through threat, erasure, or disappearance. Still, memory has a way of bleeding through. A priest's letter, a guard's drunken confession, a survivor's unfinished note. These are the ghosts that linger, whispering to us that the silence was never total. And if silence can crack once, it can crack again. When fragments of testimony, like Joseph Adler's confession or Father Benedict's hidden letter, began to circulate quietly among scholars and journalists, they attracted the attention of men who believed in documents more than whispers. These were not grieving families or drunken guards. They were investigators, archivists, reporters, determined to carve through the silence. The first was Matthias Kappel, a young journalist for the Salzburger Volksblatt. In 1896, he began a series called The Lost Carriage, drawing on witness gossip and private letters. His articles never reached print. The first proof pages were seized by authorities before distribution. Weeks later, Kappel was found wandering outside Innsbruck, disoriented, insisting that time had swallowed him. He spoke of tunnels filled with humming, of lanterns swaying in invisible wind. His family had him committed to a sanatorium, where he died 2 years later. His notes, when retrieved by his brother, were nothing but blank sheets. The ink had vanished. Next came Professor Heinrich Drosler, an amateur historian at the University of Vienna. He was fascinated by railway records and discovered a discrepancy in Rosenheim's ledgers. 11 carriages, listed at departure, 10 at arrival, Yet the accounting books for ticket sales matched only 10. It was as if the missing passengers had never bought tickets at all. Drossler pressed the university for access to the ministry archives. Days later, his office caught fire. He was never seen again. A third name surfaces in French police records. Claire Dumont, a Parisian translator who stumbled upon Hartmann's withdrawn paper on resonant stasis. She wrote to colleagues that the article referenced an Alpine experiment and promised to publish a translation. She never did. Her apartment was found empty in the spring of 1898. Neighbors recalled only a tall man in a grey overcoat who had visited her the week before. One by one, the investigators were removed, not simply silenced, but erased. Their papers destroyed, their reputations dismantled, their very existence blurred. But traces linger. In a box of discarded railway stamps at a Viennese flea market, a collector found a slip of paper, folded and torn, in handwriting not unlike Kappel's. On it were only 3 words: Die Uhr luegt, the clock lies. The phrase appears again in Drossler's unfinished lecture notes, retrieved from the ashes of his office, and once more, carved faintly into the underside of Dumont's writing desk, discovered decades later by a new tenant. 3 investigators, in different countries, at different times, all leaving the same message. The clock lies. What did they mean? Perhaps that the official records of hours and departures had been tampered with. Perhaps that time itself was not behaving as it should. Or perhaps both were true. It is telling that the fellowship's first victims beyond the passengers of Carriage 9 were those who sought only to understand. The whistleblowers, the curious, the scholars, they posed no military threat, carried no weapons. But knowledge itself was dangerous. To the fellowship, knowledge was contamination. So they erased not just evidence, but the people who dared to collect it. And still, the symbol spread. In the rubble of Drossler's office fire, a student claimed to find a charred scrap of parchment. On it, faint but visible, was the inverted hourglass. The message was unmistakable. The fellowship did not fear exposure. They welcomed the attempt, because every effort to uncover them proved their reach, their control, their ability to unmake truth itself. The investigators' fates were warnings. When you chase the missing carriage, the carriage will chase you back. When we strip away the rumors, the erased names, and the vanished investigators, what remains is a question so simple, it chills the bone. Why? Why 47 passengers? Why an entire carriage? Why silence the witnesses, rewrite the ledgers, replace the numbers? The fellowship's answer can be pieced together only from fragments. Letters half burned, diagrams smuggled into private collections, and one set of technical notes found in the archives of a Swiss watchmaker whose family later swore he was taken by men in uniform. The notes describe a device not unlike a musical instrument. Copper coils wound tight around an iron chamber, resonant plates calibrated to specific frequencies, quartz lenses set like eyes into the walls. The human body, it claimed, is not only flesh and bone, but vibration. Heartbeats, neural pulses, cellular oscillations, all are rhythms. If one can alter rhythm, one can alter life itself. One line, circled twice in red pencil, reads, "Suspend biological process, consciousness intact." Oh, not immortality, not resurrection, suspension. A way to hold living beings in perfect pause, to stop the clock without breaking it. The fellowship, in their private writings, called it stasis. For Count von Rauth, it was grief made science an attempt to preserve his daughter against the decay of time. But for the society as a whole, the applications were far broader, far darker. A letter from Judge Carl Weiss, preserved in an estate auction, puts it plainly. Imagine soldiers placed in stasis, preserved until battle, immune to hunger and age. Imagine witnesses held in silence until their usefulness passes. Imagine power eternal, unspoiled by time's cruelty. This is not mercy, this is dominion. It was not about saving lives, it was about controlling them. The Rosenheim incident, then, was no tragedy, but a test. 47 passengers were not unlucky victims. They were subjects, chosen because they were ordinary, replaceable, and because their disappearance could be explained away. The fact that they were silenced so effectively only proved the fellowship's reach. And what of the hum? Testimonies converge on that detail. The vibration that made teeth ache, lanterns flicker, glass tremble. The device was not elegant. It was crude, brutal, noisy, but it worked. Sister Agnes described faces frozen mid-motion, spoons hanging in the air, eyes open yet unblinking. The Boston Tavern testimony spoke of passengers trapped like statues, and the anonymous account in the Alpine newspaper draft described a man in a grey coat, holding a device that glowed blue, as though he alone could step outside the vibration. The implication is horrifying. The fellowship had found a way not only to suspend others, but to move freely, while the rest were trapped. A prison of time from which only the jailers were exempt. The erased investigators seemed to grasp this. Die Uhr, the clock lies, may not have been metaphor at all. It may have been a warning that the hours we count are not always real, that time can be bent, halted, falsified, that what we believe has passed may, for some, still be happening. And then comes the most disturbing question of all. If Carriage 9 was placed in stasis, if the passengers were suspended instead of killed, where are they now? One document, smuggled from the estate of a Zurich banker, offers a hint. It refers to a house in the Alps, where the subjects remain preserved. The banker adds only 3 words before the page cuts off. They still breathe. If the Rosenheim experiment was about power, then the years that followed were about silence. Silence, not in the poetic sense, but in the administrative, surgical efficiency with which inconvenient voices were erased. Lucas Gerhardt was the first. His diary, with its jagged handwriting and fevered repetition of phrases like, "The hum returns," and "They have not stopped the clock, only hidden it," paints a portrait of a man unraveling. In 1873, he filed a report to the Bavarian police, claiming he had proof of the fellowship's device. The report was politely acknowledged, then quietly misfiled. Months later, Lucas was dismissed from his teaching position at the university for erratic conduct. Friends noticed he had grown gaunt, paranoid, jumping at the sound of train whistles. He told a colleague he believed the fellowship could pause him at any moment, snatch him into the same frozen state as the passengers. That colleague later recalled a final meeting. Lucas clutching a bundle of papers, whispering, "If I vanish, the truth is in the cellar." Weeks later, he did vanish. His apartment was found locked from the inside, the fire still burning in the stove. The cellar was empty. He was never seen again. But Lucas was not the only one. Sister Agnes of Rosenheim lived until 1879, though she no longer spoke of the carriage. In her convent journals, preserved by accident, she wrote in careful Latin of nocturnal visitors who asked her to retract her testimony. She refused. The final entry, written in a shaking hand, reads, "The bells ring, though no hand pulls the rope. He waits by the door. 2 days later, she died in her sleep." The convent doctor listed heart failure. The Boston Tavern witness, Hans Kappel, emigrated to America. For a time, he blended into the immigrant neighborhoods, telling fragments of his story in hushed tones. But by 1881, even he was silenced. A coroner's note from New York records him as drowned in the East River. The body was never recovered, and then there were the investigators themselves. Every official who touched the Rosenheim file seemed to meet the same fate: reassignment, discredit, disappearance. One Bavarian magistrate, Otto Reiner, moved to Vienna after being pressured to close the case. His letters reveal a man torn between fear and duty. "They have perfected the art of removal," he wrote. "Not killing, not exile, a subtler erasure. They persuade the world you never existed at all." In 1882, his townhouse was found empty. His wife and children insisted he had died years earlier, though neighbors swore they had spoken to him the week before. The pattern was unmistakable. Anyone who probed too deeply, anyone who insisted on keeping the memory of Carriage 9 alive, was erased, not always violently, but completely. And yet, a few traces slipped through. In 1885, a scholar in Prague published a pamphlet under a pseudonym, describing the fellowship's device as a clock that lies, a rhythm that enslaves. The pamphlet was confiscated within weeks. The printer was fined for obscenity, but a single copy survived, hidden in the binding of a hymn book, discovered only in 1963. It is easy to look at these scattered fates and see only paranoia, the madness of grief. That is precisely what the Fellowship wanted. Madness was the perfect cover story. A witness who claims trains can stop time is not dangerous, he is laughable. But when every witness, across decades and continents, suffers the same discrediting, the same vanishing, the same whispered warnings, it becomes harder to dismiss. Lucas was right. They had not stopped the clock. They had hidden it, and the hidden clock ticked on, silently shaping the lives of those who dared to notice. For nearly half a century after Lucas's disappearance, the Rosenheim affair seemed buried. The railway ledger was rewritten, the carriage sold for scrap, and the survivors silenced. It might have remained a forgotten rumor had it not been for an archivist in Munich in 1921. Her name was Clara Hofstadt, a quiet, meticulous woman with little taste for politics but a love of dusty shelves. While cataloguing documents seized from disbanded aristocratic estates after the Great War, she stumbled upon a bundle of papers labeled simply Abnormal Incidents, 1,870-173. Inside were fragments, the unsigned Bavarian police report, a torn copy of the pamphlet from Prague, and a series of sketches of a machine with resonant coils. Clara's notes in the margins show her confusion. Why are these reports suppressed? Why the consistent phrase die Urluegt? Her curiosity grew dangerous. She wrote to colleagues in Zurich, Vienna, even London, asking whether they had encountered references to a frozen carriage. One letter survives in the British Library, never mailed but kept in her drafts. If this is true, then the passengers were not killed but stored. What became of them? If the device worked, where is it now? By 1923, Clara herself was gone. Officially, she emigrated to Argentina. Unofficially, no ticket, no passport, no trace of her arrival was ever found. Her apartment in Munich was left intact, her desk neatly arranged, as if she had stepped out for tea and never returned. But the trail she left was not wasted. One of her correspondents, a Czech physicist named Milan Novak, became obsessed. He had already been studying unusual frequency experiments, claiming that sound can preserve or destroy biological tissue. Clara's packet of sketches only fueled his conviction. In 1934, Novak presented a private lecture in Prague, titled Temporal Resonance and the Preservation of Life. Among his audience were young engineers, artists, even mystics. The notes from that lecture, smuggled through the decades, contain one chilling line: if 47 could be held, why not 4,000? The Fellowship was listening. Novak's laboratory was raided in 1936. He was accused of espionage and collaboration with foreign powers. Neighbors claimed he had been taken by men in dark uniforms. His equipment was seized. Nothing was ever returned. And yet, like Clara before him, Novak left a crack in the silence. A single student, Anna Kovaříková, managed to hide one of his journals. It contained experiments with quartz and copper coils, diagrams of the same machine that Lucas had once drawn. At the back, in scrawled handwriting, were the words, "Rosenheim was a beginning. The clock still lies." Anna preserved the journal through the Second World War, passing it to her son, who passed it again to his daughter. In 1968, amid the turbulence of Prague's spring, it surfaced briefly in underground circles. Rumors spread of a frozen train somewhere in the Alps, a legend retold by students as both joke and warning. By the 1,970 seconds, the fragments converged again. A Swiss historian named Jakob Stein published a controversial essay in a journal of esoterica, piecing together accounts from Clara, Novak, and earlier Bavarian records. He argued that the Rosenheim carriage had not burned, as official archives claimed, but had been relocated. His conclusion was blunt: the passengers are still alive, locked in a mechanical pause. If this is madness, then madness is the only explanation for the uniformity of silence across a century. The essay was dismissed by mainstream scholars, yet it circulated widely in fringe circles. And once again, silence fell. Jakob Stein died in a hiking accident 2 years later. His notes vanished, but the idea could not be buried again. The rediscovered fragments proved something unsettling. Every generation, without contact, without coordination, produced new seekers. And every seeker uncovered the same pattern. Every seeker saw the shadow of the same device. It was no longer possible to dismiss Rosenheim as a ghost story. There was a mechanism. There were witnesses, and there was a consistent thread of erasure that stretched across continents and decades. The chilling implication was simple. If the passengers had not been destroyed, then somewhere, perhaps in a sealed room, perhaps beneath a forgotten house in the Alps, they might still remain, suspended, unaware that time has marched on without them. By the dawn of the 21st century, the story of Rosenheim had fractured into legend. In Bavaria, children whispered of the ghost carriage that reappeared on foggy nights. In Prague, the students of 68 retold the tale as a parable about government's freezing descent. On the internet, the story appeared briefly in conspiracy forums, stripped of names, reimagined with photographs of abandoned rail cars. But beneath the folklore, researchers once again began to find fragments, this time with the tools of modern science. In 2004, a biomedical lab in Geneva reported an anomaly. They had been contracted, discreetly, by an unnamed foundation to analyze a vial of fluid, said to be from an archaeological context. What they found unsettled them. It contained human mitochondrial DNA, yet behaved unlike any known tissue. Cells exposed to the substance ceased their metabolic activity, but remained intact, paused, not dead. The lab's director, Dr. Émile Duret, described it to a colleague as life in suspension, a candle flame frozen mid-flicker. Within days, the report was classified, the lab servers wiped. Duret resigned, citing health reasons. He has not spoken publicly since. The funding foundation's name was never revealed. But financial trails led to a familiar cluster of surnames: von Roth, Weiss, Stein, the same names that had shadowed the Rosenheim affair a century earlier. Meanwhile, physicists stumbled upon their own echoes. In 2011, a research group in Munich, studying high-frequency resonance in crystalline structures, noted a bizarre effect. Living cultures of yeast exposed to certain sound harmonics ceased activity, only to resume when the frequency ended. The lead author cautiously wrote, "It is as if time itself were interrupted." That paper never reached publication. The university archives list it as withdrawn, but whispers persisted. A graduate student who had worked on the experiment claimed the equipment was seized by men in grey suits and replaced with newer apparatus. She left academia, insisting privately that the Rosenheim machine has been rebuilt. By the late 2010 seconds, even intelligence agencies seemed aware of the story. A leaked report from a Nordic Security Council included a line about the persistence of temporal stasis research in private foundations. The section was redacted almost entirely, and then came the most chilling fragment of all. In 2019, during renovations of a disused military hospital in the Alps, workers found a sealed sub-basement. Inside was a single carriage, its ironwork rusted, its windows sealed with black resin. Graffiti on the stone walls read simply, 47. The workers were told to leave the site immediately. Within days, the carriage was removed by helicopter, wrapped in canvas, flown away to an undisclosed destination. No official explanation was offered. Local newspapers printed a brief story about asbestos contamination. The journalists who pressed further reported anonymous threats, but a photograph survives, smuggled on a phone, a blurred image of a railway door, still painted with faded Bavarian script. If true, the implication is extraordinary. The Rosenheim carriage was never destroyed. It was preserved, hidden, perhaps moved from vault to vault across generations. And if the passengers were indeed in stasis, then they are not merely ghosts of history. They are contemporaries. They are alive, even now, breathing faintly in a suspended moment that has lasted nearly 150 years. The Fellowship, it seems, has no intention of releasing them. Why would they? 47 frozen lives are not prisoners. They are proof. Proof that time can be bound, bent, and stopped. Proof that a human being can be rendered not mortal but an object, a specimen, a possession. The modern echoes suggest the Fellowship has gone far beyond a single carriage. The fluid in Geneva, the harmonics in Munich, the sealed carriage in the Alps, all are hints of a project that has grown global. And yet the question remains, for what purpose? To preserve leaders? To silence enemies? To store human beings like books in a library, waiting to be reopened when useful? The fragments do not answer. But every whisper points to the same conclusion. Rosenheim was not the end. It was the prototype. The machine did not die in the 19th century. It evolved with us. It waits with us. To speak of Rosenheim and of the fellowship that engineered it is to confront not only an event, but an idea. The idea that time itself can be taken, manipulated, and hoarded like wealth. If this were merely a legend, it would be unsettling enough. But the fragments, police reports, journals, laboratory anomalies, the sealed carriage, suggest a truth far darker, that there exists a system of power not built on armies or banks, but on the mastery of time. What does it mean to rule not with violence, but with pause? Consider the soldier on a battlefield. A bullet ends his life, and he dies once. But imagine instead he is suspended mid-step, frozen for decades, awakened only when convenient. His life is not ended, it is owned. Consider the dissident, the journalist, the thinker who dares to question. Killing her creates a martyr, but freezing her, silencing her voice in a perpetual instant, leaves no body, no grave, no cause. She simply stops. The fellowship, if the fragments are to be believed, understood this long before governments and corporations grasped it. They did not seek immortality for all. They sought permanence for themselves and paralysis for others. And yet, their writings hint at something more intimate. Count von Rauth's grief, Judge Weiss's obsession with permanence, Clara Hofstadt's marginalia, all point to a human weakness, the terror of loss. At its core, the machine was not born of ambition, but of fear. The fear that the people we love will leave us, the fear that our work will decay, the fear that our names will vanish from history. The fellowship transformed that fear into a philosophy. Better to halt the world than let it change. Better to silence the clock than hear it tick toward an ending. But in doing so, they committed a profound violence, not only against their victims, but against the very essence of life. For what is life without change? Growth without decay, motion without stillness, is not life at all. It is sculpture, it is taxidermy. The passengers of Rosenheim, if they still breathe, are not alive in any true sense. They are portraits trapped behind glass, their consciousness, if it persists, looping endlessly in a single instant. To preserve them was not an act of mercy, it was the creation of living tombs. And yet, the implications reach far beyond one carriage. What if wars were fought, not with death, but with suspension? Entire populations placed on pause, waiting in vaults until the victors decide their fate. What if economies could be rigged by holding innovators in stasis just before their breakthroughs? What if history itself could be sculpted by removing a figure here, preserving another there, adjusting the flow of time like pieces on a chessboard? It reframes the entire 20th century. The unexplained disappearances during wars, the sudden silences of political figures, the scientific discoveries that seem delayed by decades, all may not have been accidents, but interventions. And in our own century, when data flows faster than armies, imagine the strategic advantage of suspending key individuals at will. A whistleblower about to reveal a scandal paused, a scientist on the verge of a cure paused, a leader resisting an agenda paused. No assassination, no evidence, no martyrdom, only silence. This is not immortality. This is control. Control at the deepest level imaginable. The mastery of when you exist. The fellowship's genius, if one dares call it that, was not technical alone. It was psychological. They knew humanity's greatest blind spot. Our assumption that time is untouchable, that clocks are honest. By exploiting that trust, they could operate in plain sight, hiding not by absence, but by pause. A man who vanishes invites questions. A man who is paused simply ceases to trouble us. And so we return to the phrase repeated across centuries. Die Uhr lügt, the clock lies. It is not only a warning, it is a manifesto. The clock, that most human of inventions, does not measure truth. It measures only what we are permitted to see. If the fellowship holds the power to bend time, then our histories, our governments, even our personal lives, may not be what they seem. We may all be living in a carefully curated illusion, edited, paused, resumed, while the true masters of chronology remain hidden. And if that is the case, then Rosenheim was not a tragedy. It was a revelation. So here we are, at the edge of the story, 150 years after the Rosenheim carriage vanished into myth, after Lucas scrawled Die Urluicht in his trembling hand, after archivists, physicists, and wanderers each uncovered the same fragments, and each were erased in turn. The question remains, what do we do with this knowledge? The Fellowship's work was never about a single machine or a single moment on a railway line. It was about a philosophy made real. That time, the most sacred rhythm of existence, could be treated as property. They turned grief into science. They turned love into possession. They turned life into specimen. And if the fragments are to be believed, they succeeded. Perhaps, even now, in a sealed chamber somewhere deep in the Alps, or in a vault beneath a nameless laboratory, 47 passengers still breathe faintly, their eyes open, their minds looping, their lives stolen by a clock that does not tick forward. They are not gone, they are not alive, they are paused. And if that is true, then Rosenheim is not past, it is present. The danger of this knowledge is not only that it terrifies, it tempts. Who among us has not wished to stop time, to hold a loved one forever at their brightest, to escape the decay of years? The Fellowship built their empire on this very temptation, knowing that fear of loss makes us complicit. But to accept their vision is to surrender the essence of life itself. For life is not perfection, it is imperfection. It is change, decay, growth, and death woven together. To arrest that process is not to conquer death. It is to embrace a different form of it, a living death, polished and silent. The story of Rosenheim forces us to choose what we believe about the world we inhabit. If you dismiss it as folklore, then it is only a dark fairy tale, a reminder of how myths reflect our deepest fears. But if you accept the fragments, the patterns, the vanishing witnesses, the erased reports, the carriage sealed away, then you must also accept the possibility that the world you know is not the world as it is, that your life, your choices, even your history, may be curated by hands unseen, that somewhere behind the walls of power sits a clock not measuring hours, but dictating them. And yet, there is hope in this knowledge. For the Fellowship's greatest strength has always been secrecy, their silence, their ability to make witnesses vanish, to convince the world that nothing unusual happened. But the very act of telling this story, of hearing it, of remembering the name Rosenheim, breaks that silence. Every time the story is spoken, every time a listener whispers, the clock lies, their grip weakens, secrecy rots in the light. Perhaps this is why the fragments surface in every generation, why Clara could not resist cataloguing them, why Novak sketched coils in a hidden notebook, why Lucas scratched warnings into paper before he vanished. Perhaps history itself conspires to be remembered. If that is true, then the Fellowship's greatest weapon, the illusion that time is theirs to command, may also be their greatest flaw. For time is not theirs. It is ours. It belongs to every fleeting breath, every heartbeat, every story told and retold across centuries. The Rosenheim carriage is a question. Do you believe it burned in some forgotten yard, its passengers lost to history? Or do you believe it still waits, sealed in shadow, its occupants alive, their moments stolen? The answer, in the end, matters less than the act of asking. For to ask is to resist. To ask is to remember. To ask is to take back the clock. So remember this. The clock does not always tell the truth. It can be rewritten, paused, made to lie. But so can stories. And stories, unlike clocks, do not stop. The Fellowship may erase witnesses, may lock passengers in eternal twilight, may turn grief into science, but they cannot silence the telling. The story of Rosenheim is not finished. The clock is still ticking or lying, and perhaps one day, someone will find the carriage, unseal its doors, and let time rush in again. Until then, the truth waits. It waits in forgotten archives, in erased journals, in the dark corners of history, and now it waits with you.